This is Marilyn Frye. She is a philosopher and specializes in radical feminist theory. The article she wrote was called Willful Virgin, or Do I Have to Be a Lesbian to Be a Feminist? Here's a little bit about her. Marilyn was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She mainly focuses on the areas of racism, sexism, oppression, LGBTQ marginalization, and has a specific focus in social categories, what they are, and how they exist. Something interesting about her opinions and theories on social categories are that she believes that social categories are as tangible and real as the chair I'm sitting on or the house that I'm sitting in. She believes that when you socially construct something, it then becomes material. So a lot of feminists typically, see these categories, gender, sex, race, as categories that can be changed and annihilated and removed. And Marilyn, on the other hand, suggests that it's not just as easy as removing these categories because they don't deteriorate like we assume they will. Moving on a little bit. So the main issues in this article are really about not just about whether you need to be a lesbian to be a feminist, but also she talks about the relation and the development between the connection between lesbianism and feminism, and where that developed and how that affects the assumptions about feminism. And she also specifically talks about institutionalized heterosexuality, which has then created this idea that if you go against the norm, you must be a lesbian. So those are her main issues, mainly the connection between lesbianism and feminism, where it came from, how patriarchy and heterosexuality kind of reinforce not only the ideas of what it means to be a lesbian or a feminist, but also how it continues to keep women oppressed. And she really, this approach that she's taking is the dominance approach, and she very much believes in the theory of dominance and that women's subordination is directly related to how they are seen sexually in patriarchal society and the way that they are seen as being submissive and only there for male sexual pleasure or gaze. Some new concepts as she talks in the article. As I just mentioned, she talks about institutional heterosexuality, and now she's not talking, when she speaks of sexuality, she's not talking about attraction. She's talking about this, systematic ways that social institutions are built on the assumption that all women are heterosexual and therefore all women are there to serve men in whatever way that be, whether that's marriage, childbirth, sexually, just in general being subservient to men. I'll just, go further into that a little bit. She says this, that in general, in our geographical location, social institutions and practices are defined by patriarchal kinships. So that in itself kind of reinforces this institutionalized heterosexuality, meaning that men are the ones who are deciding how these social institutions are being run based on their relationships. It's also important, she notes, that it's deeply entrenched in our values and our taboos. So sometimes people might not be aware of the fact that they are a product of and or contributing to these ideas of institutionalized heterosexuality. So she suggests that all institutions enforce, create, and naturalize female heterosexuality, making it appear universal. She also goes on to discuss how many oppressive acts against women stem from institutionalized heterosexuality. So she speaks of heterosexual sexual abuse, meaning men raping women. She speaks about, heterosexual harassment, meaning, things like catcalling on the street. I'm just using that for an example. And she believes that without also the heterosexualization of women, meaning that, in ads and on TV, women are traditionally, today I know it's getting better, I guess you could say, but women are still traditionally produced in media representation as for the male gaze, meaning they're presented in a way in which kind of asks men to gaze upon them. And that has to do, she says, with institutionalized heterosexuality, which are involved in social institutions like the media. And she suggests that if we didn't have this institutionalized heterosexuality that relates to this abuse and sexualization and harassment, that patriarchy couldn't exist. It couldn't exist if we didn't have this natural idea that females are, again, naturally straight. The next concept she talks about is gynophobia. And gynophobia, she explains, which was actually a term I've never heard of before. I am familiar with the term homophobia. I hadn't specifically heard of the term gynophobia, so it was definitely new to me to hear this concept, read about this concept. Gynophobia is basically a form of homophobia that's directly related to fearing lesbians, being feared to be associated or defined as a lesbian, which in turn creates the hate of lesbians. The reason gynophobia got brought up in this article is because of the initial title about, do you have to be a lesbian to be a feminist? And she found that in the majority of the women's studies classes that she was teaching, women often were asking these questions because they had been called lesbians for being counter to what society's traditional femininity or traditional heterosexual female stereotypes were. So for instance, she had, someone who I believe didn't wear makeup or something like that. And they're like, oh, are you a lesbian? Or someone in her class who's her student's friends call her women's studies class the lesbian class, and kind of developing this fear in people. And I myself, I am a lesbian, so I have been called a lesbian before, but prior to me coming out, as a teenager and even as a younger person, often people would ask me why I hadn't dated anyone, even as a 10-year-old, which is completely strange. And, my answer was like, oh, I haven't met someone. And their answer was always, you must be a lesbian. And I turned out to be a lesbian. But just because you don't date someone or don't fit into this norm does not mean you're a lesbian. However, that seems to be the way it's being used in relation to feminism. The last concept that she brought up, and theory really, was the discussion of the willful virgin, or the wild woman, as she also refers to her as. And basically, willful virgins and wild women are basically, as she describes, women who deviate from social norms. A willful virgin is a woman who actively and willfully resists social conventions relating to patriarchal dominance. She goes further to talk about the term virgin and how, several hundred years ago, virgin actually meant a free woman, and she's kind of readopting that definition and moving forward with that. And so when she uses the term virgin, she's actually speaking about a free woman, and it has actually nothing to do with sexual intercourse, penetration, anything like that. So again, we kind of see this theme in this article about her redefining language. For instance, redefining, heterosexuality and what it means when in context to this article. And then again, this willful virgin, and even wild woman, because although she doesn't give a specific definition for wild woman, typically if you use that definition, it might refer to someone who is irrational or crazy. And yet in this case, a wild woman is someone who is, defying the oppression that she faces by going against social norms. Her social praxis in this article is how to become a willful virgin or a wild woman. So although the initial question is, do I have to be a lesbian to be a feminist? She further goes in and suggests that really that's not the right question to be asking. Maybe the right question, or a more encompassing question to ask, would be, can I be a part of patriarchal heterosexuality and still be a radical feminist? And basically her answer is no. She says that you can't live in institutionalized heterosexuality and be a radical feminist. Really, you have to kind of go against those institutions and those social stereotypes in order to be a feminist. And she also suggests that being a lesbian automatically means you are a willful virgin or a wild woman, which later, when we talk about strengths and weaknesses and ways to improve, we'll discuss how, we'll discuss that a little bit further. But mainly her main social praxis is how to become a wild woman or a willful virgin. I'll use the two interchangeably because she does in the book. So virtually virgin and wild woman are the same thing. She has a very long list in the book about how to become a wild woman. However, she's kind of playful in the way that she presents this list, and she uses the term playful. She uses the term imaginative and creative, and basically she says this is a list that is not, legislation. She basically states that she imagined this list. This is how she pictures what a wild, willful virgin would be. And so, of course, I think that leaves much room for improvement, and it also leaves room for people to add, which again, we'll talk a bit later in the video about what that means. So, to go on, here's just a very short list. I will cut to a scroll of everything. Just to go over some of those, one of the main things she speaks about is being economically flexible, meaning not being tied to a man, being able to just leave at any point and be stable in your life. Because as some of you may know, often women may stay in, not just women, but many people stay in situations that are not healthy because they're not economically able to leave, and that can be a huge range of reasons. That can be because of racism and the ability that you can't get further because you're being marginalized. It can be because you're differently abled. There's a whole wide range of things. Another one of her main points, which she spends like a paragraph and a half on, is being a, as she calls it, die-hard marriage resistor. So basically not involving yourself in any type of traditional marriage practice that we see here, at least in North America, but also across the world. Resisting going to weddings, being a part of weddings, getting married yourself. She basically sees that that's 100% a social institution in which reinforces historically institutionalized heterosexuality. Another one of her very interesting, and I think for some people radical views, she says, don't have sex unless you expect to enjoy it. You should be having pleasure for your own pleasure, not necessarily to serve somebody else, which historically, as we've discussed earlier, that's been how women have been sexually defined, as being subservient. So yes, only having sex if you expect to enjoy it, and also not defining sex or sexual orientation or anything like that based on a penis-vagina dichotomy. She also talks a lot about empowering other women and creating a sisterhood and respecting women-only spaces and supporting those spaces and creating those spaces and empowering other women, in turn empowering yourself, and to continually being out as a feminist or as a wild woman, as a non-conforming person, to always make that known, and in turn spreading that kind of ideal of breaking these social norms. Yeah, again, just supporting other women in their wildness. Just be imaginative, create music, poetry, newspapers, magazines, political actions to articulate your political values and differences. So again, not often something we're encouraged to do necessarily, often a lot, specifically in women gender studies, in social work, in social, politics, a lot of it is really policy-based, which is important, and she's definitely focused on justice, and, breaking down these women's oppression and all kinds of people's oppression. But it's in a much more playful manner and in some ways attainable because it's more individually based. We'll move on to a bit about her strengths and weaknesses. So again, as I just mentioned, a lot of her social praxis is related to the individual. So again, lots of this stuff you can do on your own. You can resist, basically. You can resist on your own, and you can also resist in a group, resisting in the way of traditional values. Again, supporting other women, that's something easy you can do. Find some groups in your community in which you can, be a part of or create your own, as she says. So again, easy form of action. It's slightly less overwhelming than, creating a policy, but still effective. And she does suggest that community resistance, it can be systemic and can be effective. However, on the other side of it, not every location in the world has the same social institutions or system that we have. And she also suggests that not all women can attain this, but it's such a small part of the article that I'm still going to define this as a weakness, that, not all women have the ability to become economically flexible, and that can be for varying reasons. Again, as I mentioned before, things like, racism and, homophobia. There's a whole, being differently abled, maybe you're, transgendered. There's a whole wide range of factors affecting why a woman might not be able to become economically flexible, and not to mention that social institutions historically pay women less. So that might not be attainable for lots of women, especially women in other parts of the world that are not the global north. Also, she doesn't necessarily acknowledge how to enlighten yourself about institutionalized heterosexuality. So once you become aware of it, you can make these steps that she has listed here that she thinks are ways to, defy these social norms, and be free of your oppression. However, if you are not aware that you're being oppressed through institutionalized heterosexuality, then it may be virtually impossible for you to achieve any of these things. Her social praxis can only will only be applied to people who are already aware of these kinds of issues. For instance, people like me, who I consider myself a feminist, but I could definitely be more counter to a lot of social norms, definitely. So again, it's maybe not as far-reaching as I think she's optimistic that it is. So that's, in my opinion, a weakness. She also doesn't acknowledge necessarily the institutionalized heterosexuality in lesbian relationships, and that still these relationships can still follow although they're not different sexes necessarily, they still can and do follow some social heterosexual norms. Not in all cases, and I'm not speaking of, a masculine individual and a feminine individual. I'm speaking of, in general, social institutions and the way people form their lives together, that being gay doesn't automatically mean you're counter to culture, in which she suggests in her book, or in the article, sorry. So I think there's a little bit of a lack of acknowledgement there, and I don't think that being a lesbian automatically makes you a feminist. Not that she alludes to that, but there's really the discussion about, can you be straight and can you be a feminist? And there's not really any discussion about being a lesbian doesn't make you a feminist, because I know lots of lesbians who are not feminists, and I know lots of straight people who are feminists. So I think a little bit lack of discussion there. That doesn't mean that those are her beliefs, but in this context, what she's speaking about, I think some of those things could have been addressed. Basically, I think that she kind of doesn't acknowledge that institutional heterosexuality affects men negatively, and it affects them differently, but just as much as it affects women, and that there's no real social praxis that she talks about that can help men kind of break these societal norms or resist social institutions and stuff like that. So I think that if this praxis could be improved, it could include some concepts for men to be able to be involved in this too. Not necessarily involved with women, because she speaks about how to become a willful virgin or a wild woman. It's really female based. But I think there could be maybe a separate set of things in which it affects how men can become, for lack of a better term, willful virgins and wild women. How do you counter a culture in which tells you that you deserve to be served? Because as she speaks, women are the servants, men are the ones being served. So how do men counter that? And I'm not sure I actually know how that, I don't know if I have any suggestions to that, because I feel like a lot of that starts, for women as adults, we can do these counterculture things in which Marilyn suggests. However, for men, because it's so ingrained for such a long time and from a kid that you should be served, that you are the powerful one, I think that, again, it makes it difficult for you to be reached in this sense. And I also think you're giving up power, and no one ever wants to give up power, especially if you've never been oppressed. So I think it would be interesting to develop some more concepts, some more social praxis that would help men become, a little wilder too. And again, I think that this doesn't, which maybe this goes back to weaknesses, it doesn't really suggest in the article that men can therefore be feminists, which is problematic. I think men can be feminists, and I think it's important that we do have male feminists. So I think that just kind of including men more in this situation, and that Marilyn would probably not be happy for me to say that, because she's very stern in her article about, not including men on purpose. And I think that moving forward, we all need to move forward, not just women. So you can't continuously counter culture and still have men having these traditional, patriarchal ideals. So it has to start somewhere. And I don't know, in my opinion, that probably starts as a child. I'm not sure if there's a whole lot one can do as an adult, because for men to counter what is being suggested, they would have to then give up privilege. And as we've seen throughout history, it's very hard for people to do that. So the ways I would improve it is basically just including, and also just acknowledging that not all women can become willful virgins and wild women because of their, socioeconomical situation or their geographical location. And many women might not just face anger by being countered, they may face violence. So, yeah, just those are some issues with the article. However, I really appreciated Marilyn's, creativity and imaginativity, and I learned a lot from this article, and the reason I chose it was because I am a lesbian and I'm a feminist, so I'm kind of a walking stereotype, as is Marilyn. She is also a lesbian and a feminist. So I have a couple of questions. One is, for the women in the class, or female identifying people in the class, have you ever been called a lesbian for not fitting into a traditional norm, whether that's, playing a specific sport or wearing your hair a certain way or not dressing a certain way or talking in a certain way, or for being a feminist? Have you ever, has someone ever used being a lesbian as a way to push you back or to make you feel like you can't speak or be who you are? And likely, really, the question can go for men too. Have you ever felt that someone called you gay or a derogatory, gay slang for, being counter to culture? My second question is, are any of you interested in using some of her social praxis, meaning any of the things that she suggested we be counter to and socially resist? Has anyone resisted that? Is anyone interested in anything that she said about that? Is anyone maybe thinking about changing something in their life in order to resist these social norms? And also, do you have any other ideas about that could be added to her list of things that help you become a wild woman or a willful virgin? And also, are there any things that men can do? Do you guys have any suggestions? Is there something that we can, work towards in helping men break down these social norms and kind of become aware of them? Those are my two questions. Thanks.